Very good. So let me welcome you to the final panel of the Stem Cells on the Mesa meeting. Our topic today is understanding and demonstrating commercial viability. And so I think what we'll do is go ahead and introduce our panelists. We have Winston Kung from Celgene, and I'll let them each give a little bit more biography and understanding of their role within their company. Donna Scarrett, we heard this morning from Mesoblast, Tim Schroeder from CTI, and Anthony Davies from Capricor. So our topic today in understanding and developing commercial viability really runs along two dimensions. We've had a series of panels earlier in the meeting addressing important commercialization issues such as reimbursement or manufacturing scalability or some of the regulatory affairs issues, but we really haven't focused very much on science and technology. And so part of what we want to do today is talk about the technology elements tied primarily to manufacturing that are important in developing a longer-term commercial development strategy. The other dimension here is really reflective of the sort of yin and yang of the previous panel, which talked about pharma's view of the regenerative medicine space and their decision criteria, their entry criteria. And so one of the things we wanted to foster in this discussion was how a younger company looking for a co-development partnership or an acquisition can really build out a development strategy that resonates with pharma. I mean, what lessons can be learned from the drugs and biologic space, and if we anticipate some of these larger companies as our long-term partners, how do we facilitate cross-education and building those relationships? So I think what we'll do is go ahead and have each panel member introduce themselves. I'll start with an opening question and then open it to the floor for question and answer. And so, Winston, if you would go ahead.
Sure. I'm Winston Kung. I work at Celgene Cellular Therapeutics. Really happy to be here, and it's great to see all the folks here, and want to thank the folks here for inviting us here to speak today. I work on the business side within Celgene Cellular Therapeutics, and that encompasses both the commercial aspects as well as the business development aspects for our group. I think some of you may have heard Perry speak earlier. Within Celgene, we've been carved out as a separate division, and the way we operate is as a separate unit. And as we think about commercial viability of cell therapy, we've decided to really embark upon two specific areas. One is cell therapeutics, and the other is around organ and tissue therapeutics. And I think some of the challenges and issues that we wrestle with, and I'm sure everyone in this room probably thinks along the same way, is on a couple of dimensions. One is really understanding the science and the mechanism of action, because I think that will really drive, I think, at least from our perspective, value as we look at not just the indications, but also explaining to patients, payers, how cell therapies work. I think the other aspect that we really focus on is around the CMC and around manufacturing, because this is, quite frankly, uncharted areas for us and I think for a lot of the industry. And we've made significant investments here, but we're not done. And obviously, we're still early in the clinic, but it's certainly an area that we think about every day, not just around CMC, but also eventually the supply chain as well.
That's great. Donna?
Thank you. I'm Donna Scarrett. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of Mesoblast. My background includes about 20 years in academic hospital practice in transfusion medicine and cell therapy. And that's a field where we operated under a highly regulated environment. We were involved in manufacturing, and we were actually also involved in the transition from conventional blood banking to providing transplantation services for conventional stem cell therapy. And I think that background and experience has provided a lot of similarities between entering into the field of regenerative medicine, where we're charting a new course in terms of regulatory expectations. We have many challenges regarding manufacturing and scaling up for initially for regulated trials and then for commercial applications. And I think that many of these challenges are what we need to consider on a regular basis when we make decisions about what do we need in addition to unmet medical need.
That's great. Tim?
Hi, I'm Tim Schroeder, CEO of CTI Clinical Trial and Consulting Services. We're a 15-year-old multinational organization that specializes in immunology and regenerative medicine. And we've worked for about the last 6 or 7 years on behalf of more than a dozen of the companies, many of which are here in the audience or presenting at this meeting. And I think now have managed about 3 dozen clinical trials in the cell therapy and gene therapy space. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I appreciate the invitation today, Bob, to participate.
That's great. That's great. Anthony?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anthony Davies. I'm Chief Technology Officer at Capricor. By training, I'm originally a biochemist and chemical engineer, and since then I've spent about 20 years in the biotech industry. I started out in the world of small molecules and moved through regular biologics, and I've actually spent probably 2/3 of my career in either gene therapy or cell therapy. Most of my career focus has been around the technical and organizational challenges of bringing these complex therapies to commercial level. I've worked on gene therapies up to multi-thousand liter scale and on cell therapies at all stages of their clinical development. And Capricor, as you heard this morning, is a fascinating example of a company which is poised to take advantage of this last 20 years in this field, and we're very much looking forward to doing so. Again, also thank you very much to the organizers. I think this is one of my favorite meetings of the year, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel.
Yeah, so we'll all echo this is our favorite meeting. It's wonderful to come to San Diego and meet our peers and friends, there's no doubt, and it's been a very, very productive meeting. So one of the things I thought we would open up with is to ask the panelists what they've learned in the last 2 days, particularly over the last 4 panels that touched on reimbursement or regulatory issues and so forth. And perhaps with Winston, I mean, what kind of take-home message are you getting out of the meeting, and did anything really ping?
I guess the key takeaway I heard was there's just a lot of challenges, quite frankly, and I think it's not just a challenge, but it's really an opportunity. This is still, I think, by and large, uncharted territories, and I think we, as a community, can really help change and help shape where that goes, and not only just on the regulatory front, but around manufacturing, around reimbursement, around all these different things that I think people have identified as challenges. I see that as opportunity because right now there really isn't a lot of precedent for how things should be, ought to be, and look, I'll be the first to admit there's probably going to be a lot of failure as we look at where this field goes, but I think that through that we will learn, and I think we will, continue to advance the field, and over time I think we will get there. But it's, I hear a lot of challenges, but I also see us finding a way to get there.
Yeah. So have the things that woke you up in the middle of the night 2 years ago, are they the same things that wake you up now?
There's probably more that wakes me up now than there were a couple of years ago, but in all candor, I think the more people focus on these problems and all working together to really think about how are we going to tackle these different challenges. I think I see, and I think there was a question asked earlier on one of the panels, like what would happen if one company had $1 billion product the next day? How would you as an organization explain that? And I think, quite frankly, it would be a good thing because it at least would give validation for everyone that works in this field that there is a path and someone's blazed it, and now we can really, as a group, look at all the different applications for cell therapy.
Yeah, that's really great. And Donna, as you reflect.
I think my reflection would be that uncertainty is not a deterrent, and we're all here because we have a mission. We're charting new territory, and that we need to move forward and find a way to bring this therapy to the clinic. I think we all have very good reasons for developing programs in the areas that we're in, and that we went into this knowing there would be regulatory hurdles, and we knew there would be uncertainties about manufacturing, and there's certainly huge question marks about reimbursement, but we need to stay the course.
Yeah. And again, do you still face the same problems you saw when you joined in, or do you feel there's a different spectrum of problems, that progress has been made and you're uncovering new
New
hurdles to
ones.
jump. Yeah, yeah,
New one.
yeah. That's great. Tim, your perspectives?
You know, I think, Bob, for me, I heard two speakers earlier today. The one captured the issue of persistence and perseverance and the importance there. And I think that's just classically true of all drug and device development. And another one quoted the numbers of 90% failure rates. And I think to some extent in the regenerative medicine space, we've maybe been naive for the last several years to think that we're not going to go through those same growing pains. And to me, what I'm hearing here is I think there's a maturing of the field and the people in the field where we've been smacked with reality. But to Donna's point, we now are coming out through those challenges and now have a better understanding of what comes next.
Yeah, that's very good. Anthony?
I see, in a very good sense, the prospect of competition in this field. And I'd just like to explain what I mean by that. I mentioned earlier that I cut my teeth in the field of small molecule research and development, in days when small molecule kinase inhibitors were an extremely innovative and cutting-edge method of treating not just oncological conditions, but other conditions. We then worked in an atmosphere of tremendous competition. Any given target had 3 or 4 very powerful, medium-sized biotechs working on it. It didn't hurt the field. It didn't hurt us. Some of them got approved, some of them didn't get approved. When some of them got approved, some of them took more market share than the other. Sometimes it wasn't quite the way around you expected it to be. But overall, that spurred the field on. So to be cup half full about this, I see, for example, multiple cardiovascular products in very rapidly advancing clinical trials on the screen just this morning. I think that's great. Not all of them will win. Obviously, I hope the ones that I work on do win. But we'll see. And I don't think that's a bad thing at all. The other thing I'll comment about, actually, if I can have 2 take-homes here, is a very common analogy, which I do love, is between the genesis of the field of monoclonal antibody therapeutics and the genesis of cell therapy therapeutics. It's a very obvious comparison. But one thing, having had a lot of friends in the 80s and 90s involved in monoclonal development, which I left and moved far left field to where we're situated now, is that a lot of the people in the early days of the monoclonal field stayed in the monoclonal field. And I think this is extremely important for the field. So to echo some of the comments about perseverance that have already been made by the panel, I look around this room and I see at least 40 or 50 of some of my oldest friends in science, and I think that's terrific. It shows that a lot of very smart people do think this is a field which will have enduring traction, and it will happen. It's here to stay. So that's certainly been brought home to me very much this year at this meeting.
Yeah, that's great. You opened a very interesting point about the benefit of a competitive environment. Yet today we've heard a couple of speakers talk about pre-competitive open development procedures. And so how do you stand on those two?
I want to get out of the pre-competitive stage. I think, to be honest, I think at least half of this field is out of that stage already. I think there can be pre-competitive activity to support them, but very, very soon we will see people solving the major technological problems, and we can perhaps come on to that a little later. And I think we'll see people solving the reimbursement issues. Obviously, overlaid on the technical development of this field is a sort of gastrulation event in healthcare in this country and around the world, which you can't pick the period in history that you live in, and this is something we'll have to deal with. But I think I'm looking forward to increased competition in this field, because I think there's not a single new horizon in medicine which has been developed that hasn't benefited from that in the long term. It may feel a little painful at the time, and I'm not sure I completely enjoyed it the first time around with kinase inhibitors, but they're now many billion-dollar drug kinase inhibitors, and we didn't suffer unduly in the process.
Yeah, so the field may be advanced beyond the pre-competitive stage when you look at clinical progress in mid to late phase clinical studies. Would you also say that to be true of the manufacturing platforms we're utilizing, or do you feel there's still room for pre-competitive development?
I do feel there's room for pre-competitive development in platform technologies.
Yeah.
I feel that pretty strongly. I think And I think some of the people who've sat up here today, like Greg Lucier's company, have made very many material contributions to that. Life Technologies, just to single them out, but there's many, many others in the field, healthcare, and the ones that have merged and acquired their competitors, the Millipores and Sartoriuses of this world. And I think that what I think is new in this pre-competitive field is that, by and large, the technical problems are now well articulated. I think we all know what needs to be done in terms of analytical method development. One of the most common phrases we've heard this week is potency assays. You just take your mind back a few years. Potency assays were something that the FDA beat you over the head with and said, you are developing potency assays, aren't you? And you say, yes, 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 we are, because you knew you'd have to check that box in the almost invisible future down the line in phase 3. Thanks actually partly to some very prescient work by people at CBER, we now understand that potency assays are our best friend. They are what will enable us to develop scalable manufacturing processes. So we are manufacturing the same drug in phase 3 as we were using in our preclinical studies. And I don't think there's anybody now complaining about having to develop potency assays. Everybody realizes you basically can't develop them soon enough and are scrambling to develop them and understand mechanism action earlier than ever before. So I think the problems are well articulated. Some of the solutions will require consortium-like activity. They will require collaboration between commercial drug development companies and commercial vendor companies, like to single out Life Technologies. But I think that will happen because those companies will realize that removing these these platform technology obstacles is going to be extremely catalytic for the field. I think at this MESA meeting, perhaps for the first time, I think that has really started to consolidate. I think the problem is formulated, and I'm really looking forward to those problems being solved over the next very few years.
Yeah, that's great. In staying in the theme of some of the solving open development questions, there recently has been a workshop and some follow-up discussion between ARM and CERM on bioprocessing and biomanufacturing. I wonder if you could just summarize the activities from that group to date.
Yeah, so that was a terrific CERM-sponsored meeting. Again, hats off to CERM for organizing meetings now which are really impacting the field, and I think that their impact will resonate for many years to come. This was a roundtable manufacturing discussion held in San Francisco a few months ago, 50 or 60 people there. It was a terrific day. Again, abundantly sponsored by many of the vendors who I've already mentioned, which I think is very informative in itself. And a white paper will be generated, which is coming out very soon, I believe, which will absolutely encapsulate the manufacturing platform technology problems and, most importantly, provide a very clear roadmap forward. So I think really there will be no excuse very shortly for people claiming, for investors, for potential pharmaceutical partners, and for bigger biotechs involved in cell and gene therapy. There will be very little excuse for complaining that manufacturing remains black box, so that the problem is poorly formulated. We don't really know what we need to do, and it scares us because I think now it's been stripped down to its bones, and I think the meeting and the white paper, which Bob's referencing, will become a landmark document in this in the progress of this field.
Yeah, that's great. Let me stay with just two other questions on manufacturing, and then we'll talk about strategic clinical development. And I'll go back to Anthony for the first, and that is you've gone from an environment where you had established a very robust manufacturing platform, and obviously with Geron having clinical entry in the spinal cord field really showed that you guys could put together that concept for manufacturing. But you've moved to a small business, basically, and you're bootstrapping up from relatively bootstrapping up. How do you mitigate risk as you start to plan out developing your manufacturing platform, risk in terms of failing to meet phase 3 expectations for cost and scalability, yet at the same time you're obligated to get a clinically suitable product into the clinic for validation?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's a very, very easy question to answer. But no.
You don't do it.
Risk mitigation is at the crux of small to mid-sized biotech development. I think one of the sort of more amusing bullets I saw in any job description for working in this field is you're comfortable in an atmosphere of considerable ambiguity. I don't think there's anybody who can pass the red face test on that bullet, but that's where you have to exist. So you exist on a continuum. So what do? You codify the risk. You codify the risk factors. So and if we're all in a capital constrained environment, capital constrained is not something which is unique to startups or to well capitalized companies. You have to the bigger the numbers get, the harder the breaths coming down the back of your neck are. So you codify your risk, and I think back at Geron, before that on Onyx's gene therapy program, and at Capricor, all three of those organizations have this trait in common. There's been extremely strong support from the highest level in the company to a rigorous introspection of risk. And as you're asking about manufacturing, I'll talk about manufacturing. There's also risk in every other area, in quality, in clinical and preclinical, and so forth. The areas of risk that are most concerning are areas of comparability. And Kathy Zokas said it best this morning. You have to start with the end in mind. Now, that doesn't mean you have to start with a 5,000-liter bioreactor. Obviously, you can't do that for multiple reasons. But you have to be extremely diligent that whatever you are doing and whatever risks you are taking, you're not planting landmines which are going to detonate down the line when you're making one of those awkward transitions into phase 3. Let me give you one concrete example. The provenance of your cells. What's the most important raw material in any cell therapy manufacturing process? It's the cells. If you have an allogeneic therapy and you're taking your cells from a single source, that source has to be qualified and validated all the way. It is extremely difficult to switch horses midstream in that regard. Has anyone actually tried to change horses in the middle of a river? There's a reason for that expression. Switching horses midstream is extremely difficult. You can get very wet. You can drown. If you have an autologous therapy, well, you've got a different sort of problem, but the provenance of your cells is equally important. You need to understand the variability of your cell source. It's still your most critical raw material. So what you do is, again, borrowed from small molecules originally and the quality by design exercises which CEDAR brought in and which CBER is now very willingly embracing from regular biologics, is you quantify the risk, you codify the risk, you rank it, and you do what you can do. And you start at the top of the list, you work your way down. As long as you've codified your risks properly, as long as you've taken the time to do that, and as long as you are clear to senior management, you're clear to your investors, you're clear to your board of directors where there is risk, then there will not be tears before bedtime. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to convince people that you understand what the risk is, and you've taken a quantitative approach to it. That's the best answer I can give to that problem.
So it kind of segues into a question for Tim around your experience, even in the drugs and biologics space, about clients that come forward through mid-phase clinical development without being prepared in their manufacturing platform to move to phase 3. I mean, is that something you guys have encountered frequently, or are people generally thoughtful and well prepared as they're progressing?
I think they're more thoughtful today, Bob, maybe than they were 5 years or 10 years ago. We do still get into those discussions about, I've got an improvement I think I can make, and what would a bridging program look like? And obviously, our advice back usually is get that initial indication. So many times you get derailed with trying to continually improve the product, and the clinical program ends up being diverted or delayed, and obviously be it the capital or the investors or whoever suddenly lose interest and consider it a failure. Yeah.
Do clients listen to you?
That's a great question. I think probably one of the biggest challenges that we've seen in the whole regenerative medicine space is the issue of managing expectations. And, if I can encourage, one thought is just, when you put those timelines out there, when you put those cost estimates out there, when you put those commercial, numbers out there, I think having third parties looking at it and really, trying to smack you with some reality and saying, there's a 1 out of 10 chance we could hit that, but more likely we're not. And let us tell you, we'd much rather underpromise and overdeliver than the other way around. Nobody's happy when that occurs. And so,
do you feel some of the hurdles that this group is trying to jump and solve were common in biologics and drugs, and we could learn more from that space? Or do you, what is it that you feel that's unique in our circumstance?
Well, I think that certainly the manufacturing discussion that you just heard Anthony speak to, I think, we've had some really unique challenges in this space that may have some parallels in the biologics, but probably the drugs, are relatively less, complex. I think from a clinical or regulatory perspective, one of the things is we've had to educate, the regulatory authorities about the whole regenerative medicine area, and I congratulate ARM because I think, in some regards, the society has had a role in the white papers and the constant communications. And I would say that if there's a change we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years, it's that those initial discussions of I want to get my product into the clinic are much better received, be it FDA, EMA, Health Canada, whichever the group is. And I think that's what the de-risking part that Anthony referred to when it comes to clinical or regulatory to me is, the sponsor, the biotechnology company, the pharma company, all they want to know is literally, what are the hurdles here and what are my chances? And if you can tell me what the endpoints are going to be, what the exclusion criteria are going to be, what's enrollment likely to, how many, screen failures, et cetera, am I going to have, then you can make an educated decision on, is this a program for me? And if so, where does it rank in my priority list?
Yeah, that's great. So I have a couple of questions for Donna and Winston. The first relates to our changing regulatory environment. And certainly 5 years ago, most of our regulatory environment decisions were based on North America and Western Europe, and then you saw Eastern Europe and Asia being drawn in more out of for economy reasons. And clearly, with the changing landscape in the regulatory approval process and certain nations being more aggressive about development in this space, that landscape has changed. And how have you guys changed your focus on where to conduct clinical studies? And are you motivated to take advantage of these regulatory changes?
Yeah, the last 5 years have changed quite a bit. And we've changed our approach to U.S. versus ex-U.S. as well. Early on, our initial strategy was start with the U.S. and then, at a later stage, move abroad. And now we look globally when we're assessing a program, and we look globally to see what the regulatory environment is. Certainly look for opportunities in other countries and assess all of these, including, manufacturing risk for going into certain regions of the world. All this is really part of the discussion and the decision-making early on, as opposed to start in the U.S. and then think about the world.
Yeah, Winston?
I think from our perspective, it's probably been more U.S.-centric, but I think the regulatory environment is changing, and we are obviously monitoring it closely as it relates to doing studies in Europe. But I think, interestingly, there's been a lot of movement in Japan, and we understand there's probably going to be more coming probably as early as this year. I think given a lot of interest in cell therapy overseas, it certainly opened our eyes as we think about future studies and enrolling more patients, that we should, to what Donna just said, look at it more on a global perspective. And I think even within the U.S., the environment has changed, and given all the different trials that are now ongoing, I think we hope to see continued progress there.
Yeah, and so there are some environments that emphasize allogeneic versus autologous cell use, either for cultural or political reasons. And how does that change your development strategy in the context of going after the autologous space?
Sure. It's I think our philosophy has been we will see where the data goes, and I think that's been articulated by many folks at this conference. And so if you look at our pipeline today, we do have programs both in the allogeneic setting as well as autologous setting. And I think at this point, we're probably not in the best position to say which way it ultimately goes. I think from a commercial standpoint, if we do have the data that supports one or the other, that's where we're going to drive the commercialization.
Yeah. And how you both have diversified portfolios, either alternate cell types or therapeutic approaches. And was that done at the outset in your strategic planning, or when did that enter your development process? And what drove the diversification?
Certainly for our experience, from the inception, we thought about multiple different areas. And many of those discussions were based on our understanding at the time of what the mechanistic effects of these cells could be. And when you start thinking about all these different areas, then there are multiple opportunities. Of course, over time, they become more focused and fine-tuned, and there are a lot of other factors that go into decisions about what programs to further develop.
Yeah, that's great. So if you were doing this on your own from the get-go, what would your strategy be? Would you be very off the U.S. and go for rapid approval by looking at orphan indications, or would you go after big market opportunity? Or
oh, that's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
You know, I think that certainly we're always going to consider the commercial aspects, but at the end of the day, we're all here because we're trying to develop therapies to help people. And I think if the patient population is not particularly, you know, a big dollars population, that there's certainly mechanisms for development in that area, and they are not excluded.
So with one last question, we'll then turn to the audience for Q&A. And your answer is just one word. So let me phrase the question. So certainly in the MSC space, there are a number of competing companies. And at some point, you can envision multiple products being on the market in a product class that's fairly generic right now in terms of data that lets us segment different products. Do you see the competitive fulcrum being cost of goods or potency? So all you have to do is go one or the other. Let's roll down the line. I mean, what's going to shape the MSC field, potency or cost of goods?
I think ultimately will be cost of goods.
I'm potency.
Can I put data in there?
Yeah, you can. You can.
If a drug is genuinely potent, I'm going to say, what do you mean by potency? If a drug is genuinely potent and it gives it pulls, in being so potent, it pulls sufficient dollars out of the healthcare system to make sense financially, that drug will win out. So on that basis, I will say potency, interpreting it in a somewhat broader sense of the word.
Yeah, I tend to fall on the cost of goods side, so we've got a good split for discussion. Let's go ahead and open it up to the audience for questions to come back to the panel. We have some roving, Luke is our roving microphone here. But if the lights weren't so bright, I would happily call on people. Yeah. Gil, perhaps.
Just to get things started here. So, one, congratulations to all of you on the progress and the impact you're having on the field. It's phenomenal to see. If there was one thing that you would identify as an area of common concern that you think an organization like the Alliance should be paying attention to, that you think maybe not enough attention is being paid to, what would it be?
Not enough meetings in San Diego. That's not where you're going.
I guess, Gil, I can start there. I mean, to me, the organization has made some major strides, but I certainly see a lot left on the table. I think it plays a valuable role in interacting with the regulatory community. I think it has a valuable role interacting with the financial community. And to me, a lot of it's about expectations. We always use the hockey analogy of multiple shots on goal. And it seems to me that so many of the development programs in regenerative medicine are literally about a single opportunity. And if that fails, the therapy fails, the company fails, et cetera. And I just wonder, from an ARM perspective, if there's a way the organization can, play an educational role around, there is going to be an extremely high failure rate here. And that doesn't mean to abandon the technology, the company, et cetera. And I know that's easier said than done, but it seems like sometimes the expectations are so unrealistic as to, we're going to have a success and it's going to be the first time for each one of us.
Yeah, I'd like to echo those comments and extend them and actually draw an analogy. Let's go back to the history of monoclonals and the history of recombinant proteins. So back in the early days when Genentech was developing Humulin and TPA, even before, let's not forget, monoclonals came quite a bit later than that, actually. The FDA and the predecessor of EMEA and Health Canada, they often went back to Genentech to demand more data. At that time, Genentech and the other companies that were competitive with them at that point had the capitalization to go back and generate that data. World's changed since then. The average small to medium-sized biotech company, if they go to a regulatory agency and the agency tells them they need 2 years more work to produce more data, that can pretty much be the end of that company. So I think what I want to tie it to what Tim just said is that there is this educational role which perhaps has been underestimated for quite a few years now. The barriers to investment by venture, by pharma, by other entities in commercializing these therapies, and again, as you said, a sober understanding of the risk profile, I think is something that the organizations such as ARM and CIRM and probably several other organizations could contribute to very materially. I think, again, we are definitely at a point where you can look back at the field of monoclonals and be very persuasive that in the best possible sense we are recapitulating history here. We are at a point where we're waiting for the first big approvals, and the first approvals will be big. I don't think the venture world is quite there yet. They're always about 2 years away. I don't think most of big pharma is quite there yet. We don't see deals in the cell therapy space like we saw deals in the monoclonal space, say 15 or 20 years ago. So I would ask ARM, the RM organizations, to consider this educational role very seriously. I think there's a bit of catching up to be done there.
I think on the point around the education, I think it's really to all the different constituencies articulating what the value of regenerative medicine is. And I know everyone may have their own view of what that is, but really distilling what is it that we're so passionate about and really communicating that to all the different constituents, whether it be the legislative aspects of it or the different regulatory or all the other different pieces that we touch upon, because I think having a unified message really, I think, solidifies it as they hear from all the different folks within ARM.
Yeah, that's great. Any other questions from the audience? This is where we get the panelists the freedom to ask other panelists questions. So, Winston, what probing question do you want to launch out to the audience or your colleagues here?
I guess as I sit here today, and it's 2013, where do you see the next 5 years? I know all of you have had a lot of experience within the cell therapy field, the regenerative medicine field. Where do you see things going over the next 5 years?
Yeah, I think from a technology platform perspective, I see many of the CMC problems being definitively solved. I see raw materials, supply chain problems being definitively solved. You've all, in the past worried about animal origin-free, xeno-free, et cetera, I think it was only when I joined the stem cell world in 2006, you couldn't really find a GMP growth factor as a raw material. Now, if you're in that line of, if you need them in your manufacturing process, you're inundated with sales visits from companies, multiple offerings, and I think that's just that we're approaching the end game there. I think we'll also see a maturation, and I'd actually really like to invite comment from the rest of the panel here. As an outsider to this field, I think we'll see maturation of the biostatistics of clinical trial design. I think there's a little bit of a graveyard for some very promising cell therapies that suffered from, with hindsight, suboptimal clinical trial design, suboptimal clinical trial powering. I think this field is about to emerge and blossom. So I think those are what I expect to see. And obviously, the combination of those two things will. You can get me back in 5 years' time. We'll have the big approval by then. But I really invite comments about clinical trial design.
I think within 5 years we will hopefully see another 1 or 2 or more licensures, for one, and then the onset of discussions about some second-generation products where we're able to then take advantage of some of the progress in manufacturing and really start to think about how do we make this better, how do we deliver it easier, how do we increase the duration of effects and really bring something to the clinic.
Yeah, that's a really exciting prospect.
Yeah. I guess the two answers that I would have, the one about, in 5 years, I'd like to think, my analogy also goes back to the biotechnology era of 20 years ago where my former company, when we had our first commercial product approved and had a profitable quarter, I think we were the 10th or 11th biotechnology company to actually make it to profitability. And I'd like to think from a regenerative medicine standpoint in the next 5 years, while now there are dozens and dozens of biotech companies that are profitable, to think could we consistently have, some people in the regenerative medicine space that are showing financial viability and consistent profitability. And then to your question, Anthony, I think the optimism that I have in some regards, and I think some of the speakers earlier yesterday and today talked to some of these regulatory changes, I'd like to think that the regulatory authorities are sufficiently educated and motivated today that your issue about the statistical powering and the sample size and things like that, for a number of years they've been giving oncology companies what I consider a shortcut to approvals. And yet they don't give that in some other divisions. And I think the question is, are we in a position that we can either exert some influence, do some education, or just beg for the opportunity to have some approvals based on small sample size that maybe are not statistically powered the way that the therapeutic areas are used to operating?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from the oncology field in that regard, actually, not just from their strategic approach to garnering approval, but concepts like adaptive clinical trial design, an incremental build of clinical trial design with a very close relationship with the agency during the execution of clinical trials. I think those are things which have been pioneered by oncology, the oncology field, and have yet to be significantly adopted in this field.
That's a good point.
So Donna ask a favorite question. Do you have a question for the audience or a panelist? Or it can include how quickly do we move to the beers at the end of the day today?
I think my question for the panel is, we've talked about challenges, and we're all here. We've been in the field for many years, and so what do you see as the highlights of the last 10 years of this field of regenerative medicine, and sort of the New York phrase, how are we doing?
Yeah.
Well, we are seeing pharmaceutical partnering. I think obviously 10 years ago that wasn't the case. We're seeing greatly increased analyst coverage, and we're seeing coverage of publicly traded companies by higher and higher tier analysts, no longer the super specialists who are only interested in this field for some idiosyncratic reason. As I said, I think the maturation of the field around the field, the maturation of the vendors, people providing services to the cell therapy industry, it's changed out of all recognition. And we have, again, I'm sorry for naming names again, but we have real heavyweights. We have GE Healthcare involved in this field. Life Technologies is a titanic company and has also has a very significant commitment to this field. And there's merger and acquisitions, significant mergers and acquisitions in the field around the field. So I think this is something which I think again could be folded into this educational goal of the industry organizations to convince investors that, look, these people are putting real dollars and real development infrastructure into this field, So now it is time that you should do so as well.
So I'm curious about, as a question for the panel, about new technologies in the clinical biomarker space that seem to be emerging. And you see people utilizing miRNAs as regulatory elements that appear to be measurable in blood and can be associated with disease. And people are looking at the exosomes or microvesicles that secrete both protein or RNA components. Have you guys seen that as a critical area in terms of fostering surrogate endpoints in trial design and using that to learn more about mechanism, or do you think it's too early, it's premature in terms of these tools demonstrating success?
I think that biomarkers the field of biomarkers is a field which is extremely rapidly becoming critical to the whole of medicine, and not just a regenerative medicine. And I'll happily take a couple of minutes to explain why. I think that MERS and some of the more recently discovered molecular entities certainly have a lot of attention, but I think good biomarkers do not need to be recently published, shall we say. We are developing some mighty expensive medicines, okay, whichever way you slice it. We are developing some medicines which are mighty expensive. We're not alone in that, okay? It's not all about Provenge. Avastin is $50,000. There are many monoclonals which command colossal prices. And this will increasingly demand justification. In no small part due to the fault of the field of regenerative medicine. For the first time in the history of our civilization, we're at a point where we can produce more efficacious medicines than we can afford. Okay? This has nothing to do with Obamacare. This has nothing to do with economic collapse or debt default, although some of those things, at least, are not going to help tremendously in this process. It's just an evolution of society, okay? In the Middle Ages, you could make all of the willow bark extract that you wanted, and it was still significantly below the GDP per head of any given country. Now, you can get ill, and you can, if you have a large bank account, go out and buy medications that will make you better to an unprecedented degree. If you're unfortunate in your life, many people could spend more than they will ever earn in their lifetime on effective drugs. Okay? So, what to do? Well, even these very effective drugs are, we now increasingly realize, only effective on a subpopulation of those to whom they are administered. So the concept of companion diagnostics is running like a wildfire through medicine. You need to be able to identify why and which patient population within the disease indication you are treating will benefit from that drug. Now, I'm not just talking about regenerative medicine, but I am talking about regenerative medicine. Okay. Well, that's a bad thing, because then you're going to be denying people that drug on this basis. Yes, that's true, and this is a very significant, a very weighty decision to make, so these diagnostics had better be extremely well developed. Are you denying the medication? Well, not exactly. You're denying them a medication which basically won't be effective. So they should move on to the next standard of care, which is, you know what you're offering is not going to be effective. Okay, move on quickly and get them onto the next standard of care. And the combination cost of that, that prognostic biomarker or that companion diagnostic, plus the cost of your very expensive medication, will still be less per capita of treated patient than just machine gunning the entire patient population with your drug. And trust me, increasingly, year over year, exponentially, that will not be tolerated by regulatory agencies, and that will not be tolerated by reimbursement bodies. So I think, I think there's many interests. I think the reason that some of these molecules that Bob mentioned are coming to the fore is because people, again, to use the shots on goal analogy, people want as many shots on goal in this area as they can.
Do you think this is being driven more by pharma and healthcare than by regenerative medicine companies? And are we drafting behind them, or do you feel we're running in parallel?
No, I think we're drafting behind them, to be perfectly honest. I think I think it's being driven. If you make me stratify the industry in that way, which I think is a good thing to do, I think that it is primarily being driven by large to very large biopharma. These are companies which were biotech companies within the last decade, and they have developed extremely sophisticated and effective, yet expensive drugs, and they are now realizing that perhaps for their next generation of products, this isn't going to fly. I think it's those companies which are pioneering here. I think it's the Clovis's, I think it's the Genentechs, companies like that are driving this field.
Bob, the only two things I would add to that, is I think it's a very worthy goal to have this personalized medicine. But I must say, in the studies where we have biomarkers added at a very high level, they sometimes can add as much as a third to the cost of a program. And if you don't know how a biomarker is going to necessarily impact your therapy or guide your therapy, my suggestion is I would look at either sub-studies or proof-of-concept studies rather than putting it into your big clinical programs, which then, of course, presents a little bit of a challenge because if you do show a relationship, the question of getting the biomarker approved or cleared in concert with the drug, it sometimes can hold the drug process up. But I would just throw out there, and we hear this discussion all the time about these expensive therapies. The drug that always, I think, is number one the last several years is the Alexion Solaris eculizumab, which is $400,000 US a treatment course. And I would say to you, they didn't need a biomarker. I mean, at the end of the day, and this is, I don't know if people are necessarily in touch with this, but if you look at their package insert, they have two indications. One is PNH and one is HUS. And in both of their cases, they have 100% response rates in their pivotal trials. If you've got something that's transformative like that, I would submit you may not need a biomarker. It literally worked in everyone in their pivotal trials. But if you have something that maybe is just accretive, to current standard, then the issue of trying to tease out which group is most likely to benefit from it, I think clearly the biomarkers is a strong way to consider.
Yeah, I think that's a great counterexample. If you're diligent, I think one of the sort of really trivial but important comments I'd add to this as well is when you're doing your clinical trials, your early stage trial, keep plenty of retains of your samples. Okay, it's much cheaper to buy a freezer than go back and have to recruit another patient population. But if you do that early stage and you look at your biomarkers and you look at and again, tie it back to mechanism of action and you look at your patient response rate, if you see 100%, happy days. I'm delighted. There will be no companion diagnostic needed. I completely agree.
Yeah, Donna or Winston, were you going to comment?
Well, I was just going to mention, reiterate one of the earlier comments about being a bit more creative about clinical trial design and the overall development pathway, and that we should make sure we think beyond the traditional phase 1, 2, 3 pathway and really ask our questions up front. What do we really need to demonstrate with this program, and have that discussion with the agencies as opposed to, do I have enough to get into a safety study? What do I need what do I need to demonstrate efficacy? And I think that's a way that we can help move the field forward and really bring this therapy to the clinic. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'll say one thing, and it's something we struggle with daily, and it's as we think about where to take these cells, it's, I think to what you said earlier, big commercial opportunity or going into more orphan or niche indication. And I think where we shake out is we really want to see a transformative, and I'm glad you used the word, difference in where these cells can work. I think it solves a lot more problems than trying to target a large indication off the bat, because I think you've probably seen a lot of examples of companies who've gone that route, and I think the success there is probably fairly limited in my estimation.
Yeah, that's great. So questions again from the audience? And in the absence of that, any last thoughts from the panelists? Or not, but you're welcome to have a final thought, and we'll go ahead and wrap up. So, and we'll start here.
I think just continue to be persistent. I think this is just the beginning, and again, want to thank everybody for being here.
Yeah, well, again, thanks to the Alliance for bringing us all together. I think it's a powerful and very well-respected organization, and I think that concerted communications from this organization will be taken very seriously.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Bob, the one thought that I have is, just around additional roles for ARM that Gil was speaking to earlier. I've seen surveys where literally they put lawyers and politicians in the pharmaceutical industry always at the bottom of the list of most respected industries, which to me is befuddling, because I think the things that the pharmaceutical industry has done over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years is amazing. But I don't think that as an organization, pharma has done themselves or us any favors in marketing to the general public about, yes, they are for-profit entities, but look at the good that they've created, through their organizations. And I just think from a regenerative medicine standpoint, we have a tremendous marketing opportunity about the good that's going on, and how can somebody like the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, how can they, be at the forefront of trying to get that message out, of, even companies that are just at early stages about the potential benefits that these therapies have.
Yeah, it's really good.
And so I don't have a solution, but I just throw that out there as a challenge.
I really agree with that. I think this field, I think what we're seeing in the recent years and what we'll continue to see very shortly is the end of the beginning. You see people with, you see job titles that you never before saw in this industry. You see support organizations that are migrating to this industry for the first time. And I think one of the great things that ARM has done is to be somewhat of a backbone of the integrity of the industry. So I think at this, as we go through the end of the beginning, the industry has to retain its integrity. Earlier today, stem cell tourism was discussed, and I think there was unanimity on the panel that this is not an acceptable activity for civilization to indulge in. I think there's been a bit of a vacuum into which non-approved, non-authorized, and non-endorsed therapies have flown into, and I think now that's being, for very good reasons, is being pushed out by the development of legitimate, placebo-controlled, double-blind clinical trials, and I think that's what we'll see. And I congratulate and thank the various organizations that have contributed to this. I think this is the end of the beginning, and it's very much time for everybody to keep their wits about them, keep their head down, and stay the course.
Yeah, it's been very encouraging from all folks. I wanted to make one announcement. Many of these same questions and discussion topics have been posed to pharma, business development, and top R&D leaders through a survey organized by the Science and Technology Committee at ARM. And there will be data coming back out to this community following that. I think that would be very interesting to read. I anticipate a white paper with a nice block of data from pharma in terms of their perspective on the space, criteria for entry, and many of the topics we've discussed here. This has been a very enlightening and encouraging group. I really thank you all for being so straightforward to the audience here and rendering your opinions. It's great. So let's thank everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah.